The Titanic was the largest and most advanced steamship of its time, often referred to as unsinkable. However, on its very first voyage, it collided with an iceberg and sank. Let's now talk about the history of the Titanic and its key discoveries 110 years after its demise. From ancient times, people used sailboats for seafaring, which continued for thousands of years. But everything changed with the invention of the steam engine. It was a massive leap forward, a true industrial revolution in the 19th century. Sailboats gradually faded into the past, making way for steamships. Unlike sailing vessels, steamships did not rely on the wind, making sea transport more predictable. One of the most popular maritime routes became the journey across the Atlantic Ocean from Europe to America and back. It was here that intense competition for profit unfolded among passenger shipping companies. In the early 20th century, the prominent British company White Star Line, in order to outdo its competitors, commissioned the construction of three gigantic ocean liners named the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. While they were not the fastest, they surpassed all others in size, luxury, comfort, and passenger capacity. No expense was spared in their construction. Titanic, the second to be launched, became the largest ship in the world and the largest man-made moving object in history. The liner was as long as 3 football fields and as tall as a 17-story building. Contrary to maritime tradition, no champagne bottle was smashed against its hull after construction, as the creators considered such rituals relics of the past. The Titanic could accommodate around 3,500 people, and passengers had access to a variety of amenities, including a heated swimming pool, a Turkish bath, a small gym, various restaurants, a library, smoking lounges, open and enclosed promenade decks, spacious lobbies, and wide staircases adorned with oak and walnut. One of the most distinctive features of the interior was the first-class grand staircase under a glass dome, which was truly breathtaking. Lavish cabins and expensive furniture made passengers forget they were on a ship and not in a prestigious hotel. The Titanic had a well-thought-out system for unsinkability. The lower part of the ship's hull was divided by bulkheads to prevent flooding. The Titanic could remain afloat with 4 flooded compartments either in the bow or stern, or with any 2 compartments flooded. Journalists called the Titanic unsinkable, and its creators shared this belief. To avoid cluttering the deck, only 20 lifeboats capable of accommodating less than half of all the people on board were placed there. The number of lifeboats complied with the regulations of the time, and the liner easily obtained approval for commercial voyages. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic embarked on its maiden voyage from Europe to America. The departure of such a massive ship from Southampton led to an unfortunate incident. A ship, the New York, was moored nearby, and the turbulence from the water caused it to shift, snapping its mooring line. Its stern came dangerously close to colliding with the Titanic, coming within several inches of each other. After stops in France and Ireland, the Titanic set course for America, traversing the Atlantic Ocean, where ice fields and large icebergs were frequently encountered. Their danger was underestimated by sailors at the time, as previous encounters with ice had not resulted in loss of life, fostering a false sense of security. Approximately 2,200 people were on board the Titanic, with more than half of them being passengers. The ship's accommodations were divided into 3 classes. The wealthiest and most influential individuals of the time occupied the first class. The second class consisted of middle to upper middle class passengers, and the third class mainly consisted of poor immigrants seeking a better life. Guild workers from various professions were also among the third-class passengers. Barriers were in place to separate the third class from the first and second classes to prevent the potential spread of infectious diseases. The captain of the Titanic was 62-year-old Edward Smith, who had spent more than half his life working for the White Star Line Company and was highly regarded. The ship's officer corps was composed of experienced sailors. Additionally, the Titanic's creators were on board, including the initiator of its construction, the managing director of White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, and the chief shipbuilder, Thomas Andrews. On the fateful night of April 14, 1912, despite numerous iceberg warnings, the Titanic was traveling at full speed, at 21 knots. There was no moon in the sky, only stars, and the weather was calm with no wind. The sea surface was like a smooth mirror. Many passengers remember the sudden drop in temperature, as the air temperature went from +6 degrees during the day to 0 degrees in the evening. Captain Smith was resting in his cabin, and his assistants were in charge of the ship. Closer to midnight, the lookout spotted an iceberg directly in the ship's path, about 500 meters ahead. This was when the alarm was raised. Informed by First Officer William Murdoch on the bridge, The Titanic ordered a reverse and turned the helm to the left in an attempt to avoid the iceberg. Due to the Titanic's immense size and inertia, it was moving forward with great momentum, and the turn was slow. Unfortunately, they couldn't avoid a collision. At 11:40 p.m., the liner grazed the iceberg on the starboard side, and in less than 10 seconds, the iceberg pierced the steel hull below the waterline. The damage proved to be critical, and water began to rush in with immense force, filling at least 5 forward compartments. While the ship could stay afloat with 4 flooded compartments, it couldn't with 5. It became apparent that as water filled the damaged compartments, it would spill into adjacent ones, gradually flooding the ship. The unsinkable liner was slowly sinking. The captain ordered a distress signal to be sent out and began directing passengers to the lifeboats. Initially, people were reluctant to leave the ship as there were no visible signs of distress, and the lighting on board was still functional. The first lifeboats were lowered into the water half empty, as women and children were hesitant to be separated from their husbands and fathers. As the gravity of the situation became clear, the evacuation picked up speed, and panic ensued. Some fought for their lives until the end, while others resigned themselves to their fate. The ship's orchestra continued playing music on the deck until the very end. Both the captain and the chief shipbuilder did not attempt to save themselves. Meanwhile, the ship slowly slipped beneath the waves, with the stern rising higher and higher. At some point, the stress on the structure became too much, and the ship broke in two. The bow section sank first, followed by the stern 2 minutes later. After the collision, the ship remained afloat for 2 hours and 40 minutes. During this time, almost all the lifeboats were lowered into the water, except for the last 2, which were washed away by the sea. About 700 people found refuge in the lifeboats, while approximately 1,500 others were left in the icy water. In the quiet night, cries and pleas for help pierced the air for about half an hour. The voices gradually faded away. Only 2 of the 20 lifeboats returned to rescue those in the water, saving fewer than 10 people. It would later be estimated that there was enough room in the lifeboats for at least 400 more people. About an hour and a half after the Titanic disappeared beneath the waves, the Carpathia arrived at the scene and began picking up survivors. For nearly a month after the tragedy, bodies and debris were found in the vicinity. The North Atlantic greeted them with lifeless bodies on the water's surface, and sailors called that area the floating cemetery. Just over 300 bodies were brought ashore and laid to rest. Mostly, these were passengers from the first class. Over 1,000 people disappeared without a trace in the ocean. For several years following the Titanic's demise, many captains steered clear of the area. When news of the Titanic's sinking broke in the newspapers, the entire world was shaken by the scale of the disaster. Investigations later revealed that on the day of the tragedy, the Titanic's radio operators had received at least 6 iceberg warnings on their route. However, only 4 of these messages reached the bridge, and the last update came just 40 minutes before the collision. The Titanic's radio operator did not listen to all the messages and interrupted the communication because he was busy sending personal telegrams for passengers. Despite the iceberg danger, the Titanic was sailing at maximum speed, a common practice at the time. Additionally, the lookouts were not equipped with binoculars. When changing shifts, one of the officers had placed the binoculars in a safe, taking the key ashore. Weather conditions on that night were unusual. There was no wind, which would have caused ripples on the water and created white foam lines around the iceberg, making it more visible from a distance. The iceberg itself was likely dark, as it had probably flipped shortly before the incident, with its underwater portion not reflecting light well. A light haze on the horizon, which was referred to as fog by the lookouts during questioning, might have actually been an atmospheric optical illusion caused by the meeting of cold and warm air layers. This phenomenon is known as a mirage, and it contributed to the late sighting of the iceberg. The decision to attempt to avoid the iceberg by turning the helm to the left and giving full astern was considered less than optimal by experts. A more effective strategy might have been to give full astern to the left propeller while keeping the right one ahead. Another possible option was a head-on collision with the iceberg, which would have left the ship afloat in some capacity. In reality, decisions had to be made quickly, and there was no time for a thorough evaluation of alternatives. The issue of evacuation was also challenging. There were only 20 lifeboats, and the crew did not have time to launch them all properly. The last 2 lifeboats were washed away by the water. During the subsequent inquiries, an astonishing fact emerged. Approximately 20 minutes 30 kilometers from the Titanic's sinking location, another ship, the Californian, was stationary. Its crew had seen 8 white distress rockets in the sky, but the ship's captain, Stanley Lord, did not take action. Instead, he informed a sleeping captain in the cabin, and Lord ordered signals to be sent in the direction of the other ship, suggesting that there were other vessels in the vicinity. For instance, half a century later, journalists wrote about a ship named Samson that was engaged in the illegal hunting of seals. When the distress rockets appeared in the sky, the Samson's crew believed they were being pursued by the United States Coast Guard, so the poachers hastily decided to disappear into the night. As for the accuracy of this information, it's hard to judge as there is no concrete evidence. The initiator of the Titanic's construction, the director of White Star Line, Bruce Ismay, faced significant criticism. He was accused of boarding one of the lifeboats while women and children were dying on the ship. Although Ismay's involvement in pressuring the captain to increase the ship's speed could not be proven, his reputation suffered greatly. He was forced to resign from his position at White Star Line and spent the rest of his life in seclusion. Finding those responsible for the disaster was challenging due to the imperfect laws and regulations of the time. For instance, there were no rules specifying the speed at which passenger ships should travel in icy conditions. The lack of binoculars for the lookouts and the disorganized evacuation efforts were also criticized. The situation for third-class passengers was particularly dire as they were not timely informed of the danger, and some passageways were closed. When they finally made it to the upper decks, most of the lifeboats had already departed. Surprisingly, the captain operated the ship like many others did at the time, believing that ice was not a serious threat because it had not resulted in significant human casualties before. Therefore, the 1912 inquiry concluded that the disaster was caused by a combination of unfortunate circumstances. However, another inquiry the following year reached a different conclusion. It found that the high speed of the liner, despite warnings of ice in the area, was a significant factor. White Star Line was held partially responsible and was ordered to compensate the survivors and the families of the deceased. A list of recommendations was created to prevent similar incidents in the future. The number of seats in lifeboats was adjusted to match the number of passengers on board, and launching distress rockets at sea became an established signal for help. Ultimately, the disaster led to the establishment of the International Ice Patrol, which continues to monitor iceberg movement in the northern part of the Atlantic Ocean to this day. The Titanic's wreckage was first discovered in 1985 at a depth of 3,750 meters. The bow and stern sections were found separated by 650 meters, surrounded by thousands of small debris pieces. The entire hull of the ship is covered in rust and strange formations. Microbiologists attribute these formations to the growth and accumulation of bacteria that feed on the metal of the ship and possibly human remains. No human remains or skeletons were found on the Titanic, likely because they had decomposed over the years. The researchers found only footwear, lots of it, eaten by marine inhabitants. Each discovery of shoes carried a haunting feeling, as it spoke of the lives lost in the tragedy. Thanks to 21st century technology, many interesting details about the ship's sinking have been established. According to research, after the break, the Titanic's bow descended to the seabed at a speed of 55 km/h at an angle of 15-30 degrees. Upon reaching the bottom, it buried itself almost up to its anchors, and the hull deformed, causing decks to fold onto each other. The sides were pushed outward, but unlike the bow, the stern sank differently. It descended at a speed of 80 km/h, initially with the propellers facing upward. Then it leveled out and spiraled down, sustaining significant damage. Deck layers piled onto each other. Part of the hull plating was torn off and scattered. Predictions suggest that within a few decades, the ship's decks may not withstand their own weight and collapse. The question of how exactly the iceberg breached the ship's hull is still debated. Some claim that the strong rivets, which came apart upon impact, caused the damage, while others argue that the cold seawater made the steel plates more brittle, causing them to crack instead of bending. Both versions are based on the fact that a significant amount of slag remained in the metal after production. In the early 20th century, this was the best that industrial technology had to offer. The actual puncture point remains unseen, buried beneath a thick layer of mud. It is more likely that the hull was not punctured by the iceberg, but rather crushed or dented. This caused the seams of the hull to buckle and open. Judging by the speed of flooding, the total area of the holes was approximately 1 square meter. All damage was concentrated on a segment measuring 90 to -100 meters. This led to the flooding of at least the first 5 compartments. Disagreements also persist regarding how the Titanic broke into 3 pieces. Some witnesses claim the breakup occurred above the water's surface, while modern research suggests the breakup happened in a submerged position when the stern rose to a 30 degrees angle. The Titanic disaster remains one of the most famous tragedies in human history and has had a profound impact on culture. Numerous books, articles, essays, and several films, notably James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic, have been produced. While the movie centered around a fictional love story, Cameron paid close attention to historical facts and realistically depicted the chaos during the liner's final hours. The Titanic catastrophe is a reminder of the rare convergence of unfortunate circumstances that occurred on that fateful night. The ship was considered safe for its time. It's just that the force of the impact exceeded the hull's design limits. It serves as a reminder that nothing can be entirely foolproof, and it underscores human vulnerability in the face of natural forces. More than 110 years have passed since that event, and the world has seen wars and revolutions, yet the legend of the Titanic continues to captivate.
Action stations. Let's give them a hard time. Enemy force detected. Enemy destroyer sighted. Enemy cruiser sighted. We've spotted an enemy submarine. Our team has taken the lead. Torpedoes, get ahead. Torpedoes, direct front.